The flight was supposed to be routine, just another leg of the journey home after a relaxing vacation. Danielle and Marcus Carter, a young couple brimming with excitement about their growing family, had boarded the plane with smiles on their faces. But as the aircraft soared at 35,000 feet, something unexpected and life-changing was about to unfold. Danielle, who was 8 months pregnant, had been feeling fine during takeoff. She'd even joked with Marcus about how they were cutting. It close to her due date by flying now. What are the chances, she'd teased, leaning back in her seat. But halfway through the flight, things took a sharp turn. A sudden sharp pain shot through Danielle's abdomen, causing her to gasp audibly. Marcus turned to her immediately, concern etched across his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, placing a hand on hers. "I don't know," Danielle replied, wincing as another wave of pain hit her. "It feels different this time." Marcus didn't waste a second. He pressed the call button for the flight attendant, explaining that his wife might be going into labor. The first crew member to arrive was polite but seemed hesitant. "Are you sure it's not just discomfort from sitting too long?" she asked, glancing between Danielle and Marcus. Marcus shook his head firmly. "No, this isn't normal. We need help. Now." Word spread quickly among the cabin crew, and soon 2 more attendants joined them. They exchanged quiet whispers, casting uncertain looks at Danielle. One of them suggested giving her water and trying to keep her calm, while another mentioned contacting the pilot to see if they could arrange an emergency landing. Yet nothing concrete happened. Minutes ticked by, and Danielle's condition only worsened. Each contraction brought fresh waves of agony, leaving her clutching Marcus's arm tightly. Meanwhile, other passengers began noticing what was happening. An elderly woman seated nearby leaned over and offered words of encouragement. "You're strong," she said softly to Danielle. "Just breathe." Across the aisle, a man traveling alone shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly worried about the lack of action being taken. Even children sensed the tension. A little boy stopped playing with his toy airplane and stared wide-eyed at the commotion. Marcus tried to stay composed, but frustration simmered beneath the surface. He couldn't understand why no one seemed willing to step up. Wasn't there supposed to be some kind of protocol for situations like this? As a tech entrepreneur, Marcus was used to solving problems efficiently. This situation felt chaotic, disorganized, and deeply unfair. And then amidst the chaos, a thought crossed his mind, one that made his stomach churn. Could it be because Danielle was black? It wasn't the first time Marcus had encountered subtle biases in professional settings, but never had he imagined such prejudice would rear its ugly head in a moment so critical. Still, he pushed those thoughts aside for now, focusing instead on getting help for his wife. He raised his voice slightly, addressing the nearest flight attendant. "Please, can we get someone with medical training here, or at least tell us what's going to happen next?" The attendant nodded nervously and disappeared toward the front of the plane. When she returned moments later, she delivered disappointing news. There was no doctor on board, and diverting the flight would require significant deliberation. Marcus clenched his fists under the pretense of rubbing Danielle's back. He knew airlines often avoided diversions unless absolutely necessary. They were costly and inconvenient. But this wasn't just any inconvenience. This was his wife and unborn child's lives on the line. As Danielle struggled to breathe through another contraction, Marcus scanned the cabin, looking for anyone who might offer assistance. That's when he spotted her, a middle-aged woman sitting several rows ahead, clutching a book titled Nursing Fundamentals. Hoping against hope, Marcus caught her eye and gestured for her to come closer. The woman approached cautiously, introducing herself as Linda. "I'm a retired nurse," she admitted, "but I haven't delivered a baby before." Though far from ideal, having someone with medical knowledge nearby felt like a lifeline. Marcus thanked her profusely as she knelt beside Danielle, assessing her condition. Linda confirmed what Marcus already feared. Danielle was indeed in active labor, and the baby was coming sooner rather than later. Despite Linda's presence, the flight crew continued to dither. They provided blankets and bottled water, but little else. Passengers started murmuring amongst themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the lack of urgency. Marcus overheard snippets of conversations. "Why aren't they doing more?" one person whispered. Another muttered, "This wouldn't happen if she looked different." Though Marcus couldn't prove it, those comments stung. They echoed his earlier suspicions and fueled his growing anger. Time dragged on agonizingly slow. Danielle gripped Marcus's hand tighter with each passing minute, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't just in physical pain. She also felt abandoned, betrayed by the very people meant to ensure her safety. Marcus, meanwhile, wrestled with a storm of emotions: fear for his wife and unborn child, fury at the airline's negligence, and guilt for not being able to do more himself. And yet, despite the dire circumstances, there was a flicker of determination in Marcus's eyes. If no one else would help Danielle, he would find a way to make sure she and their baby survived. Little did he know, the events unfolding on that cramped airplane would set off a chain reaction neither he nor the airline executives could have anticipated. By the time the captain announced they were preparing for an emergency landing, tensions in the cabin had reached a boiling point. Passengers clapped half-heartedly, unsure whether relief or resentment dominated their feelings. For Marcus, however, the ordeal was far from over. What happened next would change not only his family's future, but also send shockwaves through the aviation industry and beyond. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, the situation inside the cabin grew increasingly tense. Danielle's contractions were coming faster now, each one more intense than the last. Her breathing became shallow and labored, her face pale with exhaustion. Marcus stayed by her side, holding her hand tightly and whispering words of encouragement, but even his calm demeanor couldn't mask the panic bubbling beneath the surface. The retired nurse, Linda, did her best to guide them through the process, offering advice on how Danielle should breathe and position herself to ease the pain. But without proper medical equipment or assistance, there was only so much she could do. The flight attendants, who had initially seemed hesitant to act, now hovered nearby, occasionally checking in but offering little practical help. They brought extra blankets and cups of water, but these gestures felt woefully inadequate given the gravity of the situation. "Is there anything else we can do?" one of them asked weakly, glancing nervously at Danielle as another contraction racked her body. Marcus bit back a sharp retort, reminding himself that losing his temper wouldn't help anyone right now. Instead, he nodded curtly and said, "Just keep us updated about the landing." Passengers around them began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, some craning their necks to get a better view of what was happening. A few people offered kind words of support. "You've got this," one man called out, but most remained silent, unsure of what to say or do. The mood in the cabin was a strange mix of anxiety and helplessness. Some travelers pulled out their phones, snapping photos or recording videos of the unfolding drama. Others buried their faces in books or magazines, trying to distract themselves from the tension. Despite the chaos, Marcus tried to focus on the task at hand, keeping Danielle as comfortable as possible. He dabbed sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth and encouraged her to take slow, deep breaths. "You're doing amazing," he told her repeatedly, though his voice cracked with emotion. Danielle managed a weak smile, but her eyes betrayed her fear. She squeezed his hand harder during each contraction, her nails digging into his palm. "I'm scared, Marcus," she whispered between gasps. "What if something goes wrong?" Marcus swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay strong for her sake. "Nothing's going to go wrong," he replied firmly, though doubt gnawed at him. What if the baby came before they landed? What if complications arose that neither he nor Linda knew how to handle? These questions swirled in his mind, but he pushed them aside, focusing instead on the immediate needs of his wife and unborn child. Meanwhile, the flight crew's indecision continued to frustrate everyone on board. While the captain had announced plans for an emergency landing, details were scarce. Passengers exchanged worried glances, wondering why the plane hadn't begun descending yet. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the airline was delaying the diversion because it would cost too much money. Others speculated that weather conditions made landing impossible. Whatever the reason, the lack of clear communication only added to the growing sense of unease. Linda, sensing the mounting frustration, stepped up her efforts to assist Danielle. She explained that babies often arrived quickly once labor progressed to a certain point, which meant time was of the essence. "We need to prepare for the possibility that the baby could come while we're still in the air," she said quietly to Marcus. His heart sank at the thought, but he nodded grimly, knowing they had no choice but to face reality head-on. With Linda's guidance, Marcus gathered supplies from the limited resources available on the plane. Blankets were folded into makeshift, pads and plastic bags were repurposed as protective barriers. A small first aid kit provided basic tools like gloves and antiseptic wipes, though it was far from sufficient for such a critical situation. As Marcus worked, he couldn't help but feel a surge of anger toward the airline. How could they send passengers hurtling across continents without adequate provisions for emergencies like this? It was reckless, irresponsible, and, he suspected, tinged with bias. His suspicions deepened when he overheard a snippet of conversation between two flight attendants. One of them muttered something about making exceptions for certain passengers while the other shrugged dismissively. Though their voices were low, the implication was clear enough to make Marcus's blood boil. Was this why they'd been so reluctant to intervene earlier? Because Danielle didn't fit their idea of someone deserving priority treatment? He clenched his jaw, vowing silently to hold the airline accountable once they landed safely. Back in her seat, Danielle braced herself for another contraction. This one stronger than the rest. She cried out in pain, drawing sympathetic murmurs from nearby passengers. Marcus knelt beside her, stroking her hair and urging her to push through it. "You're incredible," he told her, his voice thick with emotion. "You're going to meet our baby soon." Despite the harrowing circumstances, there was a flicker of hope in his words, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, life finds a way to persevere. As the minutes dragged on, the plane finally began its descent. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they would be landing shortly at a nearby airport, equipped to handle medical emergencies. Relief washed over Marcus, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the hardest part might still lie ahead. If the baby came before they touched down, he and Linda would have to deliver it themselves, with no guarantees of success. Danielle, too, felt a mixture of emotions. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but she clung to the thought of holding her newborn child in her arms. "We're almost there," Marcus assured her, squeezing her hand tightly. She nodded weakly, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. Around them, passengers held their breath, watching and waiting as the plane descended closer to the ground. When the wheels finally touched down, cheers erupted throughout the cabin. For many, it was a moment of collective relief, a shared triumph after hours of uncertainty. But for Marcus and Danielle, the ordeal was far from over. Paramedics boarded the plane almost immediately, rushing to Danielle's side with oxygen tanks and medical equipment. As they carefully transferred her to a stretcher, Marcus followed closely behind, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Would their baby be okay? Had the airline's negligence put both mother and child in unnecessary danger? And what would happen next? Though the worst of the crisis seemed to have passed, Marcus knew this wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was just the beginning of a much larger fight, one that would challenge not only the airline's policies, but also the systemic issues underlying their treatment of marginalized passengers. As he climbed into the ambulance alongside Danielle, he resolved to use his voice and influence to ensure no one else ever faced the same nightmare they had endured. Mid-flight. The ambulance ride from the airport to the hospital felt like an eternity. Danielle lay on the stretcher, her face pale but determined as paramedics worked quickly around her. Marcus sat beside her, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. Despite the whirlwind of activity, there was a lingering tension in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had narrowly avoided disaster aboard the plane. The baby was coming soon, and while the medical team reassured them everything would be fine, Marcus couldn't shake the memory of how close they'd come to delivering their child 35,000 feet above the ground. At the hospital, Things moved at lightning speed. Nurses guided Danielle into a delivery room where machines beeped steadily and bright lights illuminated every corner. Marcus stayed glued to her side, refusing to leave even for a moment. He answered questions about Danielle's medical history, when prompted, but his focus never wavered from her. "You're amazing," he told her over and over again, brushing strands of hair away from her damp forehead. "We're going to meet our baby so soon." Despite the chaos of the past few hours, Danielle found strength she didn't know she had. With each contraction, she pushed harder, fueled by the determination to bring their child safely into the world. The doctors and nurses were calm and efficient, offering guidance and reassurance with every step. For the first time since the ordeal began, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't alone anymore. They were surrounded by professionals who knew exactly what to do. Finally, after what felt like both seconds and hours, the sound of a tiny cry filled the room. A wave of relief washed over everyone present. Danielle collapsed back onto the bed, tears streaming down her face as she reached out for her newborn daughter. The nurse gently placed the squirming bundle in her arms, wrapping her in a soft blanket. Marcus stared at the little miracle before him, his heart swelling with awe and gratitude. She was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a shock of dark hair that reminded him so much of Danielle. For a moment, the weight of everything they'd been through melted away. All that mattered was the precious life cradled between them. Marcus leaned down to kiss Danielle's forehead, his voice trembling as he spoke. "You did it," he said softly. "She's here. Our baby girl is here." Danielle smiled weakly, exhaustion etched across her features but joy shining brightly in her eyes. "We made it," she whispered, her voice hoarse but full of emotion. As the initial euphoria settled, reality began creeping back in. Though they had welcomed their daughter safely into the world, the events leading up to this moment lingered heavily in Marcus's mind. He replayed the flight over and over, the dismissive attitudes of the crew, the lack of urgency, the whispered comments that hinted at something deeper than mere incompetence. It gnawed at him, not just because of how close they'd come to tragedy, but because he knew others might not have been so fortunate. By the time the hospital staff finished checking on mother and baby, reporters had already gathered outside. Word of the dramatic mid-flight birth had spread rapidly, thanks in part to passengers posting videos and updates online. Journalists clamored for details, eager to share the story of the couple who delivered their child against all odds. Hospital administrators politely asked Marcus and Danielle if they wanted to speak to the press, assuring them they could decline if they preferred privacy. But Marcus saw an opportunity, a chance to turn their harrowing experience into something meaningful. Standing beside Danielle's bedside, still holding their newborn daughter, Marcus addressed the reporters crowding the doorway. His tone was measured but firm as he recounted the events of the flight. He spoke candidly about the pain and fear they endured, the negligence they faced, and the suspicion that racial bias played a role in the airline's response, or lack thereof. "My wife needed help, and instead of stepping up, they hesitated," he said, his gaze steady. "That hesitation could have cost us everything." The room fell silent as Marcus continued, his words resonating far beyond the confines of the hospital room. He described how Danielle's cries for assistance were met with delays and excuses, how passengers stepped forward to offer support while the crew dithered. He praised Linda, the retired nurse who had done her best under impossible circumstances, and thanked the strangers on board who offered kind words and prayers. But he also called out the airline for failing to prioritize human life, emphasizing that such negligence wasn't just unacceptable, it was dangerous. Danielle listened quietly. As Marcus spoke, her eyes filled with pride and admiration. She knew how hard it was for him to relive those moments, especially now that they were safe and sound with their daughter. But she also understood why he felt compelled to share their story. If speaking out could prevent another family from facing the same nightmare, then it was worth every ounce of discomfort. As Marcus wrapped up his remarks, he turned his attention to the baby in Danielle's arms. "This is our daughter," he said, his voice softening. "She's proof that even in the darkest moments, miracles can happen. But she's also a reminder that we need to hold people accountable when they fail us." The reporters nodded solemnly, snapping photos and jotting notes as Marcus concluded his statement. Back in the quiet of their hospital room later that evening, Marcus and Danielle reflected on everything that had transpired. Their daughter slept peacefully in her bassinet, blissfully unaware of the drama surrounding her arrival. Marcus sat on the edge of Danielle's bed, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. "I don't want anyone else to go through what we did," he said quietly. "Not because of someone else's carelessness or prejudice." Danielle nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You're right," she murmured. "But I'm proud of you for standing up, for making sure our voices are heard." Marcus smiled faintly, though his expression remained resolute. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Holding the airline accountable would require courage, persistence, and perhaps even sacrifice. But as he looked at his wife and daughter, he felt a surge of determination, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This wasn't just about seeking justice for themselves. It was about creating change for others. With that thought in mind, Marcus picked up his phone and opened his email app. He typed out a message to the executives at the airline subsidiary he'd recently partnered with, setting the stage for what would become one of the most pivotal decisions of his career. Little did he know, those simple keystrokes would ignite a firestorm of controversy and set off a chain reaction that would ripple through industries far beyond aviation. The days following Danielle's delivery were a blur of emotions, media attention, and quiet moments spent marveling at their newborn daughter. Marcus and Danielle named her Amara, a name they had chosen months earlier, meaning eternal or unfading. To them, it symbolized resilience, hope, and the miracle of life that had emerged despite overwhelming odds. But while Amara brought immense joy into their lives, the shadow of what had happened mid-flight lingered over Marcus like a storm cloud. Back home, the story of Danielle's emergency birth continued to dominate headlines. Social media buzzed with outrage as people shared videos from passengers on the flight, highlighting the crew's apparent indifference and delays. Hashtags like "Justice for Danielle" and "John Accountability in Air Travel" trended worldwide, drawing attention not only to the Carter's ordeal, but also to broader issues of systemic neglect in the airline industry. Many pointed out how race might have played a role in the lack of urgency shown toward Danielle, citing similar incidents where Black passengers reported being treated unfairly by airlines. Marcus watched all of this unfold with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was grateful for the support pouring in from strangers who empathized with their situation. Messages flooded his inbox, some offering congratulations on Amara's birth, others expressing solidarity and sharing their own stories of discrimination. It was heartening to see so many people rallying behind them, but it also underscored just how pervasive these problems were. For every person speaking up now, there were likely countless others who had suffered silently, unable or unwilling to challenge the system. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to contain the growing backlash. Within hours of Marcus's public statement, executives issued an apology through press releases and social media, promising investigations into the incident. They praised Danielle's courage and extended well wishes to the family, even offering compensation for the trauma they endured. But Marcus saw right through the polished language and rehearsed platitudes. This wasn't about money, it was about accountability. And no amount of corporate spin could erase the fact that the airline had failed them when it mattered most. It was during this whirlwind of activity that Marcus received a call from his business partner, Sarah. She reminded him of the pending deal with Skylink Technologies, a subsidiary of the same airline involved in the fateful flight. The partnership promised millions in revenue and access to cutting-edge innovations in aviation software, a major milestone for Marcus's tech startup. Executives from Skylink had been eager to finalize the agreement before the controversy erupted, but now they were treading carefully, unsure how the scandal would affect negotiations. "They're reaching out," Sarah said cautiously over the phone. "They want to meet face-to-face to discuss next steps." Marcus felt a surge of anger at the mere mention of the airline's name. How dare they think they could sweep this under the rug with a handshake and a lucrative contract? Yet, as much as he wanted to sever ties immediately, he knew walking away wouldn't be easy. His company had invested significant time and resources into developing the technology, tailored specifically for Skylink's needs. Pulling out now would mean starting from scratch with another client, potentially costing his team years of progress. Still, Marcus couldn't ignore the moral weight of the decision. He spent hours pacing the living room, replaying the events of the flight in his mind. Danielle, recovering slowly but steadily, sat nearby with Amara nestled in her arms. She listened, quietly as Marcus wrestled aloud with the dilemma, weighing the pros and cons of staying versus leaving. Finally she spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "Do what you feel is right," she said. "If working with them makes you compromise your values, then it's not worth it. We'll figure things out together, no matter what." Her words struck a chord deep within him. Danielle had always been his rock, grounding him when doubt crept in. Her unwavering support gave him the clarity he needed to make the toughest decision of his professional life. The meeting with Skylink executives took place in a sleek conference room downtown. Marcus arrived dressed impeccably, exuding confidence, despite the turmoil brewing inside him. Across the table sat a group of polished professionals, their smiles warm and practiced. They began the discussion by congratulating Marcus on the birth of his daughter, clearly hoping to ease tensions before diving into business matters. "We're thrilled to move forward with this partnership," one executive said, gesturing enthusiastically at the presentation slides behind him. "Your technology has the potential to revolutionize our operations." Marcus nodded politely, letting them continue uninterrupted. When it was finally his turn to speak, he leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but resolute. "Before we proceed," he began, his tone measured yet commanding, "I need to address something important." The room fell silent as Marcus recounted the events of the flight, sparing no detail. He described Danielle's distress, the crew's hesitation, and the suspicion of racial bias that haunted him long after they landed. He explained how those experiences had shaken his trust, not just in the airline, but in its subsidiaries as well. "You see," he concluded, looking each executive squarely in the eye, "this isn't just about my wife and daughter. It's about recognizing humanity over profit, about valuing people over convenience. Until I see real change, not just apologies, I can't align myself with your brand." The executives exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for such a direct confrontation. One of them attempted to reassure Marcus, citing ongoing efforts to improve customer service and diversity training. But Marcus cut him off mid-sentence, his voice steady but firm. "Actions speak louder than words," he said. "Until I see tangible evidence of meaningful reform, I'm afraid we won't be moving forward with this deal." With that, Marcus stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The executive sat stunned, unsure how to respond. As Marcus walked out of the conference room, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew terminating the partnership would come with consequences, financial setbacks, missed opportunities, and perhaps even criticism from those who didn't understand his reasoning. But he also knew he'd made the right choice. That evening, as he held Amara close and watched Danielle smile softly at him from across the room, Marcus realized something profound. True success wasn't measured by wealth or accolades. It was about standing up for what mattered even when it was hard. And if pulling the plug on the deal meant sending a message to an entire industry about the importance of treating every passenger with dignity and respect, then it was a risk worth taking. Outside, the world continued to react to Marcus's bold decision. News outlets picked up the story almost instantly, praising him for putting principles above profit. Online forums lit up with debates about corporate responsibility and racial bias in travel industries. Meanwhile, other companies began reaching out to Marcus, intrigued by his stance and eager to explore collaborations rooted in mutual respect and shared values. For Marcus and Danielle, the road ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. Together, they vowed to use their platform to advocate for change. ensuring that no family would ever have to endure what they did aboard that ill-fated flight. The fallout from Marcus's decision to terminate the deal with Skylink Technologies rippled far beyond the confines of that sleek conference room. News of his bold move spread like wildfire, sparking conversations across industries and igniting debates about corporate accountability and systemic bias. For Marcus and Danielle, life became a whirlwind of interviews, public appearances, and heartfelt messages from people who admired their courage. But amidst the chaos, they remained grounded by one simple truth. This wasn't just about them. It was about creating a better future for others. In the days following the announcement, Marcus found himself inundated with requests for interviews. Journalists wanted to know what drove him to walk away from such a lucrative partnership. Advocacy groups invited him to speak at events focused on racial equity and consumer rights. Even strangers reached out via social media, sharing stories of similar experiences where they felt dismissed or mistreated by airlines. Each message reinforced Marcus's conviction that he had done the right thing, not just for his family, but for countless others who might never have the chance to tell their side of the story. One particular message stood out among the rest. It came from a woman named Elena, who described being denied medical assistance during a flight while suffering a severe allergic reaction. Her email read, "I thought I was alone in feeling like my life didn't matter to them. Hearing your story gave me hope that someone is finally willing to fight back." Marcus forwarded the email to Danielle, both of them sitting in silence as tears welled up in their eyes. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about giving a voice to those who had been silenced for too long. As the weeks went by, the airline scrambled to repair its tarnished reputation. Executives launched a high-profile PR campaign, pledging to overhaul training programs for cabin crews and implement stricter protocols for handling medical emergencies on board. They even announced plans to partner with advocacy organizations to address issues of racial bias within their operations. While some applauded these efforts as steps in the right direction, Marcus remained skeptical. Actions, he believed, would speak louder than words, and until he saw tangible evidence of meaningful change, he refused to let his guard down. Danielle, meanwhile, began documenting their journey in her own way. An avid writer since college, she started a blog chronicling everything from Amara's first milestones to reflections on motherhood, resilience, and justice. Her posts resonated deeply with readers, many of whom praised her honesty and vulnerability. One entry, titled, "When Life Hands You Turbulence," went viral after she recounted the harrowing details of her labor mid-flight and how it had transformed her perspective on strength and perseverance. "Sometimes," she wrote, "you don't realize how strong you are until you're faced with no other choice." Amara quickly became the heart of their story, a symbol of hope and triumph against all odds. Friends and family often joked that she was destined for greatness given the circumstances of her arrival. Marcus and Danielle couldn't help but agree. Every time they looked at her tiny face, they were reminded of how close they had come to losing everything, and how much farther they still had to go in ensuring that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. Marcus channeled his energy into building new partnerships aligned with his values. Several companies approached him after hearing about his stance, eager to collaborate with someone committed to ethical practices. One tech firm specializing in artificial intelligence offered to team up on a project aimed at improving passenger safety through predictive analytics. Another startup focused on diversity and inclusion asked Marcus to serve as an advisor, helping them develop tools to combat bias in customer service industries. These opportunities not only reignited his passion for innovation, but also allowed him to continue advocating for systemic change. At home, life settled into a rhythm of quiet joy and purposeful action. Marcus spent evenings researching cases of discrimination in air travel, compiling data to present at upcoming conferences. Danielle balanced caring for Amara with writing articles and speaking engagements, using her platform to amplify marginalized voices. Together, they formed a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting families affected by negligence in the airline industry. Named Sky Safe Alliance, the initiative provided resources, legal assistance, and counseling to victims and their loved ones. Their work didn't go unnoticed. Within months, Marcus and Danielle were invited to testify before Congress as part of a committee investigating racial bias in commercial aviation. Sitting side by side at the witness table, they shared their story with lawmakers, urging them to enact legislation requiring stricter oversight and accountability measures for airlines. When Marcus spoke about the moment he realized his wife's cries for help were being ignored, his voice trembled, but his resolve never wavered. Danielle followed with a powerful testimony about the emotional toll of feeling invisible, her words leaving a lasting impact on everyone in the room. By the end of the hearing, several representatives pledged to push for reforms, citing the Carters' bravery as inspiration for change. As they walked out of the Capitol building hand in hand, Marcus turned to Danielle and smiled. "We did it," he said softly. "Not just for us, but for everyone who deserves to feel safe when they fly." Back home, they celebrated quietly, savoring the knowledge that their efforts were making a difference. Amara cooed happily in her crib, oblivious to the monumental changes unfolding around her. Yet in her innocence, she represented everything Marcus and Danielle fought for. A world where every person, regardless of race or background, could trust that their humanity would be valued above profit. Though challenges lay ahead, Marcus and Danielle faced them with unwavering determination. They knew the road to true equality and accountability would be long and fraught with obstacles, but they also knew they weren't alone. Countless supporters stood beside them, cheering them on and joining the fight for justice. And as they watched Amara grow, they envisioned a brighter future, one shaped by love, resilience, and the unyielding belief that even the smallest actions could spark lasting change. In the end, their story wasn't just about a baby born mid-flight or a business deal gone awry. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it meant sacrificing comfort and security. It was about refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice and inspiring others to do the same. Most importantly, it was about proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when driven by purpose and compassion.